So welcome everyone. Hey friends, this is Harry Kimple from New Relic. And my session is focusing on, like I said, the aspect of OpenTelemetry with New Relic, but I'll be using New Relic as my target observability platform of choice. But like I said, I mean, the concepts are completely based on OpenTelemetry standards, and you can use them to apply them to open source tools as well in the observability space, such as the Aspire dashboard, like we have seen before in the container, or Jaeger for tracing, or any other observability backend that support OpenTelemetry. So I only have like a few slides to show kind of like before we jump into the live demo um, and go through the configuration of the .NET Aspire eShop application. So first of all, what are the business objectives of modern, observability practices? Well, you can basically put them into these four categories: maximize uptime, optimize business, innovate faster, and operational efficiency. So what we as developers probably care the most about is our developer productivity. We don't want to use 10 different tools in order to get a job done. Ideally, we have all the necessary tools in one place. And the same is true for the IDEs, but also for our tools that we use for monitoring and observing our applications. Another aspect is, when we deploy new services of our applications, we want to deploy them with confidence, right? Making sure that everything works as expected, that the performance, all the test cases are done, that our apps are resilient, they can handle peak performance, and so on. So these are all very much focusing on, the business objectives of what we want to achieve. And at New Relic, we make sure to focus and basically on these core principles when we develop our platform. So New Relic is really an all-in-one observability platform. This is a really busy slide. I'm not going to go through all of the different content that is showing up on the slide, but I want to highlight a couple key aspects that I think make New Relic really unique when it comes to observing your applications and your infrastructure. So the first one is, and we have seen that before as well on the Azure Monitor side, is kind of like the telemetry, right? We also focus on ingesting, allowing people to ingest all the different kinds of telemetry. There's the standard telemetry that you typically see also from OpenTelemetry, like the metrics, logs, and traces. But we also support, third-party telemetry that you can ingest. You can also very easily, focus on ingesting any events. And typically when we talk about events, we talk about, or the idea is around, it's maybe like infrastructure events, where, something happened on the infrastructure, some changes happened, some deployment may have occurred, whatever it is. But when we think about events, it is much more broader aspect. It's kind of like it could be a user clicking on a website, on a button on a website, or it could be, any custom event with any kind of like attribute attached to it that you can imagine. And so these are even, custom events that you can, send in easily using our ingest pipeline. The second aspect is, of course, New Relic is a pure SaaS service we run in the cloud. And so New Relic is really built from the ground up as a SaaS service that scales with our customers' demand. We ingest up to 3.1 exabytes of data per year. Every minute, 12 billion events are processed by our pipeline, and we support tens of thousands of concurrent customers that are using New Relic on a day-to-day basis. The last aspect is probably one that is probably most important: high cardinality. And what I mean by high cardinality is probably best explained by using a simple example. So imagine, in the case of the eShop application, you're using it, you're deploying it, your customers are using it and interacting with it. But imagine you have like 1,000 issues that are occurring in your application. How can you make sure that, or how can you analyze and identify whether or not, 1,000 users have one issue, or maybe like one user has 1,000 issues? And so having this type of additional metadata that you can attach to your typically telemetry like metrics, traces, and logs is so important, especially in the case of a root cause analysis. So basically, if you have, for example, a, hashed user ID, maybe not, definitely not some PII data, or maybe some product ID or some product category that you can also attach as a custom attribute to your telemetry is so important when it comes to the analysis and the root cause analysis of your when troubleshooting. So high cardinality really means that you can store, as much custom events and metadata and to your events. And this is really something where, in my opinion, Relic really shines when it comes to telemetry. So finally, let's look at some aspects of OpenTelemetry. Many of you probably know already, and I don't go into detail. OpenTelemetry is really was initiated through a merger of two different projects: OpenCensus, that was focusing on metrics, and OpenTracing, as the name suggests, on tracing. And they got merged into a single project, to define a standard in the industry that everyone can agree on. OpenTelemetry focuses on metrics, traces, and logs, with various kinds of support for many different programming languages. And it allows you to basically define a pipeline, a collector that you can then use to process the data before you actually send it to some observability backend. And you can obfuscate, you can drop data already there. And then, finally, you can use it to send it to an observability platform of your choice. And this is really what OpenTelemetry is all about. I have a slightly different picture, but it basically explains the same kind of concept that Matt also already talked about. There's typically some design considerations and guidelines that you want to keep in mind. One is like the auto instrumentation, and the other one is the manual instrumentation. And I have this picture in mind, when I, try to, when I want to, like, make a serve a cake to my family, right? I can either bake it my own, I can choose the ingredients, and I can choose all the different flavors. I can custom make it locally at home, or I could go to a bakery, and choose one that is maybe out in the display, and I can choose it whatever suits me. So there's various kinds of pros and cons when thinking about these two concepts. When it comes to auto instrumentation, the benefit is, of course, really, there's no much setup required. You can basically attach an agent to it, configure where you want to send the data, and then you're basically done. But the con is that you only get that much level of visibility into your services. And this is really where the manual instrumentation then comes into play, because here you have full control over what is happening, what spans you want to create with maybe logs and custom metrics that you want to create. But it comes with the the con that you have to maybe add some dependencies into your applications. You maybe have to add some custom source code to actually create these custom attributes, these custom events or tags to your activities. So both of them have their pros and cons. You can get easily started with auto instrumentation, but then when it comes to getting more deeper insights into your applications, then definitely manual instrumentation is what's needed. All right. I will actually show a couple examples in the demo that we'll run through in a second that will actually highlight both of these aspects. And this already brings me to the demo portion of the session. So let me share my screen. And here you go. You should be able to see my screen in a second. All right. So this is my local machine. What I have done here is I used the standard eShop application that I cloned to my local machine. You can see this is running already on my machine. let me hop over to my browser. I can look into the Aspire dashboard, look at all the different services, what Leslie also shared earlier. There are some issues on my machine that are occurring here. And I can also then look at the details of all the different resources that I have deployed here. If I click into the details of the web app, for example, this brings me into like a lot of environment variables that are configured automatically by using Aspire. One of the important things that I want to highlight here are the OTel exporter OTLP endpoint and the OTLP headers. These are typically the two things that you have to configure when you want to export your telemetry to an observability backend. So in this case, automatically Aspire my application when I'm running it locally to send in the data to the Aspire dashboard. But what do I have to do in order to get this configured for an observability backend? This is what we'll look into in the next couple minutes. So let's go into the application and let me stop this local deployment. So my starting point here, as with we have seen already, is kind of like the app host and the program.cs file. This is the plain host. And one of the things that I can now do is, and we have seen various examples. Ideally, I will and define the extensions.cs. But in this case, I chose to actually implement it directly here into the app host, just for ease of use in this demo. So what I can do now is, for this builder project, so this is configuring the identity API, which is one service of the eShop application. What I can do now here is, if I go in here and add a .environment reference, I can then easily create some environment variables that I need. And in this case, what I want is actually the OTel underscore exporter underscore OTLP endpoint. It already comes up with a suggestion. Thanks, GitHub Copilot. So in this case, I'm not using the local host, but what I actually want to use is my New Relic endpoint. New Relic has a cloud endpoint that is able to receive any kind of OpenTelemetry data from various kinds of programming languages. .NET is one of them, but it's basically a standard OTLP, OpenTelemetry line protocol endpoint that you can use to send in any kind of OpenTelemetry data. So in this case, I'm using HTTPS : and then otel.ana-data.net. Here you go. Oops. All right, so this is the first aspect. So I'm configuring a OTLP endpoint. And since this is an open API endpoint, there's also an additional thing that we need to configure, which is the OTLP headers section, as we have seen in the front end here. So I can copy this as well and add this in here as an additional environment variable. I can paste this in here. And then as a configuration, the typical convention is, you can use API-key and then equals, and then the New Relic license key, which is kind of like the key that you would use to ingest any kind of data into the application or into our platform. This would then only, configure this for the identity service. I would then, go ahead and create all the environment variables for the other services as well. Since I don't want to look at me, and configuring this, I have already prepared a branch that has basically all the things configured. In this case, I can go again into the app host, into the program CS. You will notice that I have some additional configuration here. I have configured all the different services already with these environment variables. Like I said, this is a little bit overhead. Ideally, this would go into the extensions and the service defaults, but just for the sake of this demo, I added it in here. What I also added in here, since New Relic supports various different regions, there's an option where you can choose basically the region on where your New Relic account is deployed. It could be by default in the US or EU or any other region that you have available. And I'm reading in the keys from my environment variable. So I could then, use this to run locally on my machine again, and then instead of or on top of adding the data, the telemetry to my Aspire dashboard, it will also be sent to my New Relic account. I already deployed an application into my Azure account, so you can see I used ACD up to deploy this into my Azure account. This created this resource group, and you can see all the different services that are running here. You will also notice that, when you do ACD up, there's also in .NET Aspire dashboard already, linked and created for you in the cloud. So I could then also look at, on my Azure Container Apps environment, I can also look at the various services that I have up and running. I can then also use the application as you would. I can, click into this. I can, select certain products. I need to log in to purchase. Yes, and then I can add this to my cart. Going back, use also this nice watch, and boom, something happened. Don't worry, this is on purpose just to show you something in a second. So once I have that deployed, I can use all the configuration that is happening behind the scenes. So if I go into my web app and look at the environment variables, you will notice that all of them have the correct endpoint configured. Let's look at this, and this should point to my New Relic OTLP endpoint. If that click works. Oops, it's not for some reason. So this is already up and running. I can then hop over to my New Relic account to look at all the different entities that are getting created by ingesting the data into New Relic. So when we talk about entities, an entity in our perspective is kind of like an application or service. It could be a host, a Kubernetes cluster, whatever you use to group things together. This could be like an entity. I can see and look at all the different services that are sending in data from my Aspire eShop application. You can see some high-level information about response time, throughput, the error rate, and so on. You can see, the OpenTelemetry as configured as the provider. I can then jump into one of these applications. This will bring me into a summary page. The summary page basically shows me then the most important metrics, information, data points that you would typically look at to make sure that your application is working as expected. So the summary page should come up in a second, which will show me like the response time, the error rate, the throughput of my applications. And this already gives me like a nice overview of, the most important information. And then it also allows me to say, make an easy distinction between, is my response time going up just because I have more throughput on my application, or is something else happening, right? So in this case, I'm seeing like a spike in response time, but I'm not seeing like a spike in throughput. So there must be something else going on. I can look at the error rate, I can look at the distributed traces, and so on. We also have a so-called service map that we automatically create from looking at all of the data that we ingest. So how are each services talking to each other, what data is being submitted, and so on. I can, of course, then also look into all of the different traces, and let me maybe expand the time window a little bit. I can, of course, look at the last 30 minutes or the last 6 hours, which will show me this scatter chart of all the different, traces that we captured. I can use this table also to filter, sort, and so on. If I click then into one of these traces, this will bring me into a similar waterfall diagram that we have seen in the Aspire dashboard as well, where you can look at what was the overall response time, the overall duration of a single trace, and how it breaks down into various different services in my application. What you'll also see in a second is kind of like another aspect of what we typically do in the New Relic platform, which is we try to correlate as much information as possible to our to each and all the different telemetry that we collect. So I can look at, for this single trace, these 3 instances have been involved. I can also look at the timeline if I want to. I can see the overall response time was, X, and how does it break down into various sections of within my application. So similar view that we also see in the Aspire dashboard. What we also correlate here already is all the logs for this single trace that we captured, and I can then look at all the different logs that were part of this single trace. So also a nice way to make sure that all the things are connected and visible in the same context without me clicking around into different sections. Here you go. So now this will show up the logs for this specific trace. As part of the tracing, as you can see here already, what we also highlight is, did we find any anomalies? So was this specific execution of the trace for some reason slower than all the other traces that we captured? And so we highlight this. There was no anomaly discovered here, but there's also some capabilities that we automatically show up when you look at the different traces. We also highlight errors in each of the traces, so I can go into this specific trace, which will show me some data around errors that occurred or exceptions, which is also another aspect of the platform. I'm not waiting here in the case of time. You can in which part of the trace the error actually occurred. What's also, you can see now, the first trace, the first span within that trace was actually having some kind of issue. I can click into the details and then look into all the various attributes that we also collected. So in here you'll see further details, including the error details of that specific error. Another aspect is the metrics. Again, we are looking at the web app service. So these are only the metrics for that specific service. You can look at all the different, out-of-the-box metrics that we receive from looking at the standard instrumentation of the applications. I can then click into any of these metrics to see what was in this case, the server request duration. It will show me the average by default. I can, select the median if I want to, and I can then look at the data. What's also possible here, and this is something that New Relic had for a long time, is kind of like New Relic's own query language. So in this case, it's pretty much similar to SQL, but it focuses on the some nuances of SQL. We call it NRQL, and in this case, if I'm not interested in the median, but maybe want to focus on the percentile, I can also do that and look at the 95th percentile, for example, of that specific metric that we're looking at, and see what is actually happening. Next and finally, there's of course also all the logs. Again, looking at a specific service, I filter down to one specific service. I can look at all the logs in the given time window. So in this case, the last 30 minutes, I can look at all the different logs that we have captured from the eShop application by using the standard instrumentation of Aspire using OpenTelemetry. If I want to have a more broader picture and not like look at a single service or entity, there's also a section, a broader section called traces here. And this allows me then to see across all the services, across all the entities that we are looking at, maybe expanding this to a broader time window. I can then look at all the different traces across all my different services that I captured, and then, maybe do some deep dive into this. And the same is true also for the logs and the metrics, where I know I don't have to jump and dive deeper into a single service, but maybe get a broader overview across all my services and then dive deeper into any issues that I maybe identify from here. Another aspect that I wanted to quickly highlight here is the errors, the exceptions that we typically see. So in this case, I'm again, selected the web app as a service. I jumped into the errors section here, and you can see in the given time window, so in the last 3 hours, we actually identified 2 different types of errors. You can see how these errors occurred over time, when did we see these errors happening. And then you may notice that there's another aspect in here that we highlight. So one of these services actually has a users impacted section. And so this is really important. I mentioned it earlier when I talked about the high cardinality. This is one of the aspects. If I hover over this section, I can, this will bring me to the docs. And if I, click into this, this will then tell me, what do I need to do in order to configure this? And basically, also OpenTelemetry has some standard conventions, some semantic conventions that allow you to add custom attributes, but also in a standardized fashion. So if I want to add in have the visibility into the users impacted of my application, I can add a enduser.id as a custom attribute, as a custom tag to my traces. So let's jump over into our services. So in this case, what I did is I actually went into the web app, excuse me, into the services, basket services.cs file. And what you'll see here is I did some manual instrumentation in this piece of code. So I'm first of all getting the current activity. So this is the current actually execution that is happening. And then I'm just creating a random number that I'm using, which I'm then assigning to this end user ID to this standard, to this current activity. I could have used the basket, the customer ID, but we only have 2 customers by default in eShop application, Bob and Alice. So this wouldn't give me like too much of a spread. So this is why I use just a random number to add in here. And then what you'll also see here is, I added in some, simulated error if a certain product is used. You may have noticed it in the beginning when I actually clicked through the eShop application that with a certain product, it had some issue. And this was on purpose. I just added in some, exception in here. There's also, OpenTelemetry allows you to record some exceptions and some additional information about errors and exceptions that occurred. So if I look into my New Relic account again, I can then jump into this section. And this is exactly what you see here with these users impacted. I can see in the last 3 hours, there were 3 users impacted by this specific error or exception. And we only had like 3 distinct occurrences of this specific error. So this tells me that it is not something where a single user has maybe like 3 issues, but like all the 3 users that we have seen has similar experiences, and they all experience the same issue. So this is a way to customize your experience with OpenTelemetry. Like I said, this is fully based on OpenTelemetry standards. If you want to, you could also then, and New Relic allows you to create then custom dashboards that actually show you additional information. You can use any kind of telemetry that we collect from all the various services. This could be metrics, traces, and logs, but also any custom data and custom attributes. You could then put them on a custom dashboard. In this case, I created this .NET Aspire eShop application dashboard. And you'll notice in a second, this shows some custom information that I think is valuable for me when I look at the application. So in this case, I can see what were the total requests that we have seen. Again, in the default time window, in this case, this is the last day, how many unique users were affected. I can see how many users did we see in total, how many of those had issues. So I can use the same type of data to look at the data at various different aspects. I can look at what were the favorite products, because I'm also capturing the product ID when people put something into the cart. So a lot of very custom information that is maybe valuable for me when looking at, is my application behaving as expected. All right, let's jump back into the slides to finish this off. So basically, I added in a couple of pieces of information into the slide deck. I think we'll share these after the session. Finally, I added in some custom resources just to show you all the things that I'm using in today's session. So I have links here to the Aspire documentation on how to use telemetry in the application. I have links also furthermore into like how to configure a relic for OpenTelemetry, the link to the OpenTelemetry documentation, also in getting started guide with .NET, and finally also the link to the Aspire eShop application. And that's it from my end. Thank you so much for having me being part of this. This was exciting, and I hope you enjoyed this session.
Don't be.
Come on, Harry. You know it's not like that. You know I'm gonna not let you before you answer some questions. So I'm trying to. I took a look on some of the questions, but I need to comment one thing. I saw David Fowler in the chat. I don't know if this is the real David Fowler, but it is. Please put a good word for us for Satya. I'll be very glad on that. To be honest, if you folks don't know, David Fowler is an incredible piece on the .NET history, and he is still doing things with us, including Aspire. So, Harry, I want to ask one thing about observability. I understand how we introduced some best practices, etc., with New Relic, but what do you think is the strongest part of us using that with Aspire? It's more about the why. How do you feel this can improve our experience with .NET Aspire?
Right. So in my opinion, I think .NET Aspire definitely helps very much earlier in the process. And maybe, developing my application, I can test it locally. I can make sure that, no obvious things are occurring locally when I'm developing my application. And so I can apply the same concepts when it comes to observability. I can make sure that, it is working as expected. I can, deploy it into various different stages from my local machine to maybe staging, dev, and QA. So a lot of the same practices apply also when looking at Aspire. The only differences, in my opinion, is it's very much earlier in the development lifecycle.
Gotcha. And other than feedback, by the way, if you say feedback, I'm gonna just show that as like feedback. I don't know, it's like inverted the string, but I'm gonna say, please don't answer feedback. This is like this, folks. If you have any problems with Aspire, please open APR on GitHub. We'll be glad to answer any questions that you have. Please send us feedback, even though it's inverse, but I have no way to know how to write that mirrored. But Harry, other than the feedback for we are doing with .NET Aspire, what was the last message for us on .NET Aspire Dev Day?
I would say, look at the OpenTelemetry docs. They have so many getting started guides, so much information, on how to, think about getting started in all different kinds of languages. Yes, .NET is obviously one of them, but that would be my recommendation. And they're also all constantly evolving, right? There's so many things coming out. So, definitely check out the .NET or the OpenTelemetry docs from time to time.
Gotcha. So thank you so much, and have incredible rest of day and a rest of incredible .NET Aspire that day. And by the way, if you see the chat that I got right, yeah, baby, I will not say 1-0 because then chat will like challenge me on everything. So I'll prefer not to do that, especially on a live event. I'm not I'm not that daring. Thank you so much for that.